Hey, everybody. This is episode 40 of Set for Sentencing. I got to say, I'm super excited about this one. So let me set it up. My guest is Dr. Paul Zak. He is world famous for having spent over 2 decades researching the neuroscience behind narrative, communication, and human connection. He is going to talk to us about something he calls immersion. Immersion is a neurologic state that engages your audience and motivates them into action. I've been telling you all along that narrative is the way we persuade, and now I'm giving you the science behind it. Dr. Zak not only knows how to achieve immersion, but he has developed a revolutionary tool to measure it. It's an online platform which uses biometric responses from wearable technology like your smartwatch to measure this concept of immersion, how engaged your audience is in your message. It's incredible technology, and it's already in use by the film industry, in the advertising industry, in Fortune 500 companies, and beyond. So I've been a fan of Dr. Zak's for years, been following his research. So to have him with me on this podcast today is kind of surreal and oh so awesome. Dr. Zak was so generous with his time, and he had so much great information to share that we spent close to 2 hours together. So I'm breaking this up into 2 separate episodes. It's like one of those great double live albums of my wayward youth. Anyway, you're going to want to stay till the end next week, though, because we actually get to analyze a few minutes of one of my sentencing videos through Dr. Zak's Immersion platform. And we go through the whole thing and the results. It's incredible. So I promise you, you are going to love this. Sit back, relax, enjoy Dr. Zak, and let's get set for sentencing. Over 1 million Americans face sentencing every year, and it will be the most important day of their lives. But we don't fully understand the system, how broken it is, and what we can do to make it better. I'm Doug Passon. I'm a 25-year criminal defense lawyer and a sentencing expert. My goal is to bring more awareness, more fairness, and more humanity to the sentencing process. So, are you ready? Then let's get set for sentencing. Hey everybody, did you know that when the brain is immersed in an extraordinary storytelling experience, that brain is activated in a very specific way, and if we can deliver that experience to our audience, they will be fully engaged and, more importantly, they'll be moved into action. But creating these extraordinary experiences is very hard to do without the right guidance. So wouldn't it be nice? Wouldn't it be beyond amazing if when we craft our sentencing stories or our sentencing videos, we'd have some way to scientifically measure whether our stories are creating the emotional connection crucial to moving our audience into action? Well, you're not going to believe this, but such a thing exists. So I'm so excited to let you know that today, helping us get ready for sentencing is the incomparable, the legendary, dare I say, Dr. Paul Zak. Welcome, Dr. Zak. How are you today?
Thank you, Doug. I'm not worthy.
Oh, you are worthy. So I'm going to keep going with this. So make sure everybody knows who you are. Maybe you've seen Dr. Zak on his TED Talks, like The Biology of Good and Evil. His talk on trust, morality, and oxytocin has received almost 2 million views. You've seen him on TV. You've probably read about him in the Times, the Journal, the Scientific American, Fast Company, and on and on and on and on. So Dr. Zak is a professor at Claremont University. He is in the top 0.3% of most cited scientists. He's a 4-time tech entrepreneur. And so his most recent company, Immersion Neuroscience, has created, I'm not kidding, has created a software platform that connects with your wearables, your Apple Watch or your Fitbit, and measures what he's going to talk to us about. It's called immersion. So it's monitoring in real time how your audience is physically experiencing your stories. So he wrote a book about it. It's his latest book. He's got several. It's called The Science of the Extraordinary and the Source of Happiness. So I just want to say thank you again for what you do and for being here today. So let's dig in. Give me your origin story. I love origin stories here. How did you get involved in this work, studying good and bad behavior, trust, empathy, all of it?
There's an honest answer and a dishonest answer. Which one would you like?
Let's see. Can I get both? I'll
Sure.
decide which one I like better.
The dishonest answer is that I'm a Martian, and I'm really trying to figure out what these really interesting creatures called the humans are doing. And I do that by running experiments, and in particular, social behaviors. This old saying in psychology, all research is me search. And so I maybe studied empathy because I had some shortcomings, but it's a very fascinating topic. Why do we behave well when no one's looking? Why do we help a guy who falls off his bicycle in the middle of the street? Why do we invest a lot of resources into, quote, good behavior or moral behavior when there's very little benefit to us, or maybe no benefit at all, and certainly a lot of costs. So why would we do that? That seems like a really fundamentally interesting question to me. And we develop neurologic techniques or neuroscience techniques to identify the substrates of empathy and of helping behaviors more generally. So that's the dishonest answer. The honest answer is I had a very weird childhood. My mother's a former nun, and she had an absolute black and white view of good and evil. Wow. And when she quit being a nun, she decided to impose that on her children. And then once you get old enough, you go, wait, things aren't so black and white. So she was Catholic. Why do Catholics have all the information? What about Buddhists? What about Protestants? God forbid Protestants might know something. Mm-hmm. And so I think, in my household, we had this kind of very interesting set of debates about good and evil. And as a child, you have to listen to mom's the expert. She studied theology. But I think it's a more general, evolved desire among human beings that good behaviors embed us, sustain us in community. And as social creatures, we need to be embedded in community. And if we're not embedded in community, we're isolated and we die. So those moral behaviors or good behaviors or helping behaviors are the things that help sustain us within community, the many communities that we navigate through.
Okay, so before we go, that I have found that people actually have a hard time fully understanding the definitions of empathy. And in my work, people actually confuse sympathy, I think, with empathy. Mm-hmm. And when we do what we do at sentencing, a lot of times we do what I call these pity points of sympathy, like feel sorry for me, that I had a hard life, I've been abused, I'm addicted, I'm homeless, with the goal of maybe the judge will feel bad and cut, a break to the client. And I say, well, the sympathy, that's not really the goal. The goal is empathy. But can you tell me what's your definition of empathy, and contrast to the concept of sympathy, if you can?
It's a great question. So sympathy is understood as a cognitive process. That is, I can understand cognitively why, if you were beat up as a child, why you have poor impulse control or you're anxious or whatever. But empathy is the sharing the emotional state of the other person. And so that's done most effectively through storytelling, which and if I can do a little bit more, if I can get you to be immersed in that story, and we haven't defined that word yet, but we can, then that empathic response, what I call immersion, can motivate action, as you said in your intro. And so if I want to communicate in a way that facilitates someone taking an action, I need to first create an empathic narrative. And the second is I got to immerse you in that narrative so that you have such, think of immersion, this neurologic state that, again, we haven't defined yet, but think of this as like tension, like in a story. I'm building tension in this human being, and that person can dissipate the tension by taking an action.
All right, well, let's do immersion since we're there. Define what does that mean?
Yeah, so we started out by thinking about, as you mentioned, oxytocin. So, I'm sort of in a narrow range famous for the discovery of the behavioral effects of oxytocin on things like trust, generosity, again, more generally helping behaviors. But it turns out that the brain's release of oxytocin and its network effects in the brain are not enough to motivate action. So you need something more. The first thing that has to happen is you've got to attend to the story, right? So if you're in a courtroom and the judge is distracted looking out the window and you're playing a sentencing video or you're discussing your client during sentencing, if that judge is not paying attention, then nothing's going to happen. So the first thing is you've got to capture my attention. So I can do that by clap my hands. I can raise your heart rate. Your brain goes on. Holy crap, something just happened, or a gunshot, or a car backfiring. That's a deep in the brainstem attentional response. So I've got to get that attentional response first, and then I've got to give you. Can I use one bad word, Doug? Is that allowed?
You can use as many bad words as you want on this podcast.
So
it's for grown-ups.
As one of our clients for the Immersion platform said, you have to get me to give a shit. And why is that important? All this is metabolically costly, right? Attention is metabolically costly. This empathic response is metabolically costly. And so that's not a 0-1 variable. That's a continuous variable. There are degrees of immersion. And the more immersed I am, the more likely I am to then be to absorb that story, to process that story in my brain, but also to be influenced by that story.
So what is happening in the brain when immersion is happening?
Yeah, the first response, this attentional response, which happens very rapidly within half a second or so, is associated with the brain's release of a neurochemical called dopamine, which binds to the prefrontal cortex. So this is the same chemical that is its release is enhanced in people who take drugs for like ADD, like Ritalin, Adderall. That's that attentional response. So now I'm going, okay, I'm on. But now I need that give a shit part, right? I have to have that emotional response, which is associated with the brain's production of oxytocin and oxytocin binding in particular regions of the brain. So I think what's interesting for the audience is that there's a neurochemical pathway that facilitates an electrical response, which we can measure at the level of the brain. We can measure it in blood. We can also measure it in the cranial nerve. So these nerves are kind of the output file of the brain. So we're looking at specific neurochemicals or particular areas of the brain. We're only getting part of the story, but these cranial nerves give you this kind of full network effect, and they are highly predictive of the actions people take after a narrative.
So we did dopamine, we did oxytocin. My recollection from the Ben video is cortisol plays a role in this too. Is that right?
So cortisol is a downstream effect of dopamine. So again, cortisol is this kind of arousal chemical. Dopamine is an arousal chemical in the brain. Cortisol is in the peripheral nervous system. So that's this kind of pathway from the brain to now I'm activating this. And so in the software platform we built, so that this is available to everybody to measure what your brain loves, roughly speaking, we actually can get data from these cranial nerves from a smartwatch or fitness center, because these cranial nerves, a number of them, pass through the heart. I don't care about heart rate. I don't care about heart rate variability, but it has these kind of very subtle third and fourth order changes on the rhythms of the heart. So once we discovered that, by the way, other people know this as well, it's in the literature, then we basically wrote software that allow us to feed in heart rate, which again, I don't care about, but do a bunch of math and then infer the activity of your brain second by second in real time. So now we have a tool. And that tool allows businesses to create more effective communication, better customer experiences, better employee experiences, even measure things like emotional wellness. If a lot of psychiatric and medical disorders are associated with social withdrawal, like depression, people are depressed, they pull back, they don't socially interact with others. And immersion captures the value that the brain assigns to an experience with social content. Could be a story, could be you and I talking, Doug. It could be my kid walking in my room and giving me a hug.
All right, so sticking with the dope, I just want to make sure I got this right because the dopamine and the downstream effect of cortisol, is it fair to say, is it right to say that that's essentially that's the lean in portion of this? It's the pay attention portion, but is it also kind of a stress portion that you've been sort of rattled or shocked, or there's something tension built into this narrative that's causing you to focus your attention?
I'm going to avoid the word stress, although
Okay.
cortisol is often called a stress hormone. It's really an arousal response, right? So again, the brain takes about 20% of your calories to run, so very high overhead. So it just wants to idle.
Yeah.
So if I can kind of open hot, basically in my story, then I activate the brain to go, oh, dopamine, cortisol downstream. This is actually important for you. So a quick example, if I do a lot of hiking in the weekend with my dog, I live in the desert, and every once in a while, I run across a rattlesnake, and you hear the all of a sudden you're like, oh, holy crap,
Mm-hmm.
I'm on. Am I not paying attention? Oh yeah, I'm paying attention. I got a rattlesnake, a foot from me. I gotta deal with that now. So same thing with storytelling. What we found by looking at the book is based on 50,000 brain observations, right? Because we have a platform where every day hundreds of people are being measured. So no neuroscientist has 50,000 brain observations, but me. What we found is that if you want to influence people's behavior, you've really got to open hot, or you've got to get that brain to turn on. I don't have a lot of time. I don't know how long the sentencing videos are, but hit me hard, hit me fast, give me something to do, and then let me go. If it runs on and on and on, we could talk about long form filmmaking or storytelling if you want to, but I think we're talking about short form stories here.
Yeah, these are usually 15 the shortest one I ever did was 3 minutes. The longest one I'd done is like a half hour, and the more complicated ones, but on average we're shooting for like 10 minutes.
Perfect. And so
Yeah.
one of our longest term clients of the software platform, Accenture, this big professional services organization, has found that for training, in-person training, that people cannot stay immersed for more than 20 minutes. Right. So
Mm.
think of TED Talks, 18 minutes. So it's really, hit me hard, hit me fast, and then give me something to do. So, from the book that we actually measured people watching a whole bunch of TED Talks from terrible ones to really great ones.
Mm-hmm.
And a 10% increase in immersion, this neurologic state, would increase the number of online views for a TED Talk by 176,000.
Mm.
So that's the behavioral impact of immersion. If your brain goes, holy crap, this is the bestest thing ever, then I want to keep watching. Number one, I'm not going to turn it off. And number two, I'm absorbing that emotional information. And as I said, that's like tension. And now I'm like, oh man, I got to do this thing. So many of the great TED Talks, hopefully even a couple of mine, have a call to action at the end. And so if you've seen my TED Talk, you, Doug, or the listeners, particularly the one I did at TED Global in 2011, and what you haven't seen, because they chop it off, I won't tell you, the ending is very exciting. There's a call to action, and the entire TED conference shut down. The whole place exploded doing this particular action that I asked people to do. And the conference stopped for 10 minutes, which never happens. Standing
Wow.
ovation, just the place went, I'm going to use another bad word, apeshit crazy, because it was a great call to action that was so simple and so human. And yet I had set up the science and then demonstrated how to do this. And so that's what I think what you want with a sentencing video or any
Mm-hmm.
narrative. Open hot, get me to care about the characters, create a mystery, create a crisis, show authentic emotions, and then resolve that story with, here's something you can do, you the judge, you the jury, you the general listener.
It's all making me think of, because you were on, I know, Park Howell's podcast, and with the ABT narrative structure and all that, but this is all really making me think about this, because the last T is therefore, which is the call to action. It's right baked in the cake in the narrative. What's so cool about this is there are concepts that you're putting out there that we lawyers have known about, like the open hot. We've been taught, even as a baby lawyer in law school and trial advocacy, primacy and recency. Start with a bang, end with a bang.
Right.
And so we've known this, but the cool thing about this is I don't think anybody ever knew why. We just had a feeling that this is what's we had a vibe that this is how you get there and this is what's working, but now you've put science behind it. So that's pretty cool.
And measurement, right? I mean, knowing in general that it works, and then being able to measure and test and improve. So again, the elephant in the room is we're trying to influence people. And as we discussed before we started recording, humans are social creatures. Our brains are designed to interact with other humans. It's very natural for us to be in groups. Even think about, impaneling a jury or going to work with people you don't know. We do it so naturally. Great apes, monkeys, they don't do this. They don't do it. They'll kill each other, right? But we, oh yeah, so I'm going to be on a jury for the next 3 weeks with these doofuses, right? I'm like, oh, whatever, right? We can do it very naturally. So number one, so how do we do that? Because we can read each other's thoughts, basically, so-called mind reading, or I can intuit, if I were Doug, this is what I would do, number one. And number two, via this immersion mechanism in the brain, I can get a sense of why you care about something, your emotional state. I can read that in your body language. I can read that in your voice, right? Your voice goes up when you're stressed out. I mean, really simple things. Tapping, right? People who at their leg, they're anxious, right? All those little tells that we have that tell us about our emotional states. So we become very acutely aware, although unconsciously, emotional creatures sharing the emotion of others. And this is the super cool thing that makes all this work, which is immersion is contagious. If I took a sentencing video and I measured it, 12 people, 15 people, and I say edited that for higher immersion, I'm putting more attention into it, increasing the impact of my call to action. Then when I play it for the judge, that's going to transfer over. That it's out of the brainstem, these really evolutionarily old parts of the brain. Now, a key takeaway is that call to action is more effective if it occurs at immersion peak. So we think about kind of closing the narrative arc, but that's not always the way to do it. You may want to actually keep that tension high at the call to action, right? Actually not resolve the narrative. So if you want examples of this, look at theatrical movie trailers, which you can find on YouTube everywhere. They are half of a narrative arc. So I only know this, Doug, because a ton of movie studios have used our technology to get butts in the theaters, basically. So that's how they get paid. And so they'll basically open up. You have a mystery, you have characters. Now you have an emotion, we have a crisis. It's starting to really get hot in that crisis, and then you got a buy ticket to find out what happens next. And that's done on purpose, right? If you resolve that story, they're like, okay, well, I get what happens. Now, bad movies and bad movie trailers, you can kind of intuit something's going to happen. But so again, if I may, for listeners, concrete example. So we measured this teen movie from, 10 years ago, Fault in Our Stars.
Yeah.
About two teenagers. They're in a support group for kids with cancer. They have, tubes to give them oxygen. This young man and young woman fall in love. And then, so we already have heightened emotions. These people might die. They're falling in love. And then in the theatrical trailer, the girl then is found unconscious. She's rushed to the hospital. That's it. What happens? Does she die? Does he die? Do they fall in love? Do they cure their cancer? Do they survive? I mean, there's so many emotional directions, and you're like, holy crap, I gotta watch this.
That's the call to action, right? Buy the ticket.
So this movie cost $12 million to make. It made over $80 million in the box office.
Nice.
And they did a lot of great marketing around that, but it was a heck of a great trailer. And also it was a young adult book prior to the movie, so it already had a built-in base. So it's not all from the movie trailer, but that's just almost a perfect setup. Like, I want to know what happened. So I think from a sentencing video perspective, if I'm telling the story about this individual who's been presumably convicted, then I really want to know where he or she is going after their sentence, right? And so that can be the open kind of question. So here's where he or she was. Here's the crime. Here's the kind of some rationale for why that crime occurred. Here's how that person is the criminal. He or she is a criminal because they've been convicted, right?
Right.
How they're kind of addressing, how they're making amends to society, if you will. And then what's open is what's going next, right? So they can continue to engage in crime. They can turn their life around. They can help others stay out of gangs, whatever that is. So I think there's, that's much more than me, Doug. I'm just guessing here, but there's a bunch of kind of paths in which you can leave that open. And then as social creatures, that judge is going to fill in what he or she thinks the direction this person can go.
Yeah. The call to action during points of immersion also came up in your book in commercials, and I love the idea of these insurance commercials that you see, just tons of them, and they're all just so wacky and nonsensical, but the idea behind it is insurance is insurance. There's no way to differentiate between companies and products, so they make an interesting little narrative, and then the logo is coming up at a point of immersion, right? And is the idea just stickiness at that point, that you're going to retain that information, so the next time you're shopping for insurance, somewhere back in your brain is going to be, I'm going to use, this company with the talking duck or whatever?
Yeah, basically. So I want to tell this whole story. I want to immerse you in a narrative with real emotion, and then I'll have more impact if that branding moment occurs at a point of high immersion. So again, I may not want to do that at the very end unless I can peak up immersion because some beautiful thing or crisis is happening. By the way, these immersion moments don't have to be a crisis. They could be something beautiful. And then the child is saved from the raging river. That's a positive thing, right? It doesn't have to be, oh, the child died and you wish you had, or the father died, you wish you had insurance, right? That's kind of still also highly emotional and sad. So it doesn't have to be so-called sadvertising. It can be also happy. And so, as you said, highly immersive experiences, because they're emotional, stick in memory. They're saved in memory in particular ways. So I want to use that same tagline, the same duck, the whatever that kind of thing is, so that every place I go to think about insurance, I'm seeing that same thing, provoking the replay of that emotional response, right? Which is really interesting. And so, as you said, insurance is a poorly differentiated product, and therefore I have to sell it by talking about service, talking about taking care of people, talking about connection to others, right? And I think that's the most persuasive kind of narrative for a social creature like humans.
So I have a question, because we've been talking about mostly in the context of visual media. So my sentencing videos, commercials, movie trailers, and even though that's my bread and butter, that's what, my passion is in sentencing videos. The truth is, we don't do these in every case. We save them for the right cases, right? So, but persuasion, communication is every case. And lawyers, generally, it's about verbal, it's our words, and it's about the written word. It's either a sentencing memo, sentencing letters, character letters, things like that. Does immersion come into play in those forms of communication as well?
Wonderful question. And like every good question, the answer is it depends.
Yeah.
So we think about, again, this kind of lazy brain trying to save resources. The more cues I have for emotional states, the more immersed I'm going to be in general. So video, awesome. You speaking, great. If you can paint a narrative, again, it's got to be tight, just like the TED Talks I talk about. So I'm the worst guy to go to TED with, by the way, Tug. Don't go with me. So, because I've seen so many, I've given so many. I will sit there and critique with my friends.
Yeah.
So a lot of TED Talks are chronological, poorly designed TED Talks. You want to lead with the most important thing, right? Think of a fictional book or even a nonfiction, narrative nonfiction. Lead with the most important thing. Get me turned on. Get that lean in, as you said, Doug. I need that right away. So open hot, and then get me to tell a story. Now, I can do that on a written page, but when we look at the neurologic response, it is much lower for written text than it is for audio or for visual. So, for example, we tested movie scripts. I lived outside LA, so, movies. And if people read scripts, you can measure immersion, but the variation is small because I'm not absorbing as much information. But when a trained actor at a table read reads a script, much higher immersion, because he or she is, again, expressing that emotion in their voice. So for lawyers, and you'll have to inform me, it would be great to get some voice training so that you can actually express emotion better. And we think of the law, or I think of the law as an outsider, as very rational, very cut and dried. But of course, it's emotion because it involves humans, right? I remember an appellate judge telling me, I used to go to a lot of law conferences actually, and he said he was an appellate judge for death penalty cases, and said when he was trained, they told him, don't look at the defendant, look at the clock on the wall, because you don't want that emotion to leak into you and affect your judgment.
Mm-hmm.
So that's interesting. I don't know if that's generally a true statement, but in any case, I think for these sentencing videos, for the statements you make, they're all good if they're expressed with emotion. Again, immersion is contagious. If you immerse in this, if this is important to you, if you can put energy into it, then that energy is transmitted to others. If you can, again, capture and keep that attention. And shorter, sorry, lawyers, shorter is generally more immersive than longer.
Yeah.
So if you run long, people just can't keep up. It's just, you're burning so much metabolic energy that at some point people are going to just kind of, shut down. Like the famous lawyers that, do the 2-hour summary or whatever.
The face palm emoji, like, oh my God, because what you're saying, and I hope the takeaway for lawyers is very, very clear, but the majority of what we're doing is the written word. And we're not doing it all that well to begin with, but it's like you're already neurologically, or you got one foot in the ditch with written work, which is a huge takeaway. And you don't want people to go to TED Talks with you. I don't think a lot of lawyers want to hang out with me, because a lot of what we do on this podcast is we look at sentencings that have happened. We've been doing high profile sentencings like Elizabeth Holmes and Michael Avenatti and all these, and we've been pulling the pleadings, and we've been looking at the written work, and we've been giving our 2 cents. And the ones that are really memorable are the ones that come out hot and just get right to the point. But we're not taught that way in law school. We're taught to, like, this is the issue, and this is the rule, and the application, and the conclusion, and people are regurgitating statutes and guidelines, and by the time you get to through the first page, it's excruciating. Right. It's not absolutely excruciating.
Latin.
And wherefore and therein, and we are so, we're just so bad collectively, and it's not because we don't want to be good. It's because we're not taught right. Nobody teaches us this stuff. And this is such fundamentally a human endeavor. And we're now made into robots to do this. So I hope that's a huge takeaway. I also feel like, the idea of the judge staring at the clock is really powerful to me. So if the judge is staring at the clock because he doesn't want to look at the defendant, because he doesn't want to feel connected to the defendant, that's a problem. If the judge is staring at the clock because he knows if he looks at the defendant, he's going to have all kinds of negative judgments about him that will impair his decision, that's better from my perspective, right? But I want my judge here. I want him looking at this human being whose life is in their hands, so that they think long and hard about the true consequences of their decision, because there's no greater stakes, in life, I would argue, than when we're in a courtroom with a client by our side. And one of the things I like to talk about, and I got in trouble for this because there was a New York Times piece, but all I was doing was quoting a judge, and the judge said, our duty as defense lawyers is to make the judge suffer, meaning to make the judge suffer, meaning, it used to be easy for in federal court, especially, they had a grid. It was a sentencing guidelines, and it was a chart with numbers on a table, and you plug in the numbers and it spits out the sentence. And that was ended in 2005. It gave the judges more discretion to deviate from these guidelines. And the judge said, every good judge should agonize over every single decision that they make. And he used the word suffer. And I say, every one of our clients comes before the court with some form of suffering. They wouldn't have gotten to where they are right now if they weren't suffering in some way, suffering from abuse, addiction, mental illness, you name it. And our goal is to make the judge feel that suffering and kind of suffer right alongside with our client. So if the judge is staring at a clock during my presentation, I'm losing. That's my fear. But anyway, this is about you, not me. So let me get back to you, because I want to tell you what lawyers do. A lot of lawyers, good lawyers, really diligent lawyers, will conduct focus groups. And what they'll do is they'll call, I just got an email the other day from a lawyer who said, got a trial ready. I need a focus group. I want to deliver my opening statement or my closing argument, whatever the case may be. Please help me. I'll pay you. I do it too. When I could make a video, I have a very small cadre of people, usually non-lawyers, and I say, please watch the video and tell me what you think and how did you feel and did this work and the this and the that. And that is the way that we test the response to what we're trying to do with our narratives. Tell me about what you think about the value of focus groups.
So let's start with someone more famous than me, filmmaker Ridley Scott, who most of you know, very, very famous British filmmaker, has always said he ignores what are called screeners. So again, they practice, they do a first edit on a film and they bring in people, and it's highly technical. They give people a piece of paper and a pencil, and they ask them to make notes as they screen this early edit of the movie. And he said it's insane. Why? What's their incentive to give us feedback? Number one, that's clear. Number one, are they filmmakers? No. What do they know about storytelling, right? So why would you listen to these people? So again, if you have so-called regular human beings who are going to listen to your opening or closing arguments, what the hell do they know about anything? They're not lawyers, right? And they're not storytellers, and they're just, and then from the neuroscience perspective, my view is that you're asking people to relate, in general, their emotional response to this, which is unconscious and not open to our emotional awareness. So I call this the Freudian hangover. Freud was a jerk. It was wrong on 99% of everything. So don't listen to Freud. But he said, if you just poke enough, I can make your unconscious conscious. No, it doesn't work that way. These are separate data streams in the brain, right? Be like me asking you, Doug, how much your liver enjoyed your breakfast this morning. You go like, that's just stupid. It's the same thing of asking this chunk of tissue inside your head to tell us about your emotional states. It doesn't leak in clearly into your conscious. Your consciousness is maybe 1% of what your brain does. So it's very tiny, even though we can create language. Okay, so focus groups, if they predicted outcomes, I would love it. And in experiments we've run for 20 plus years, we always ask people, what do you think? Do you think this video is persuasive? Do you like it? None of that predicts. So why would you, I just don't get it. Why would you as a lawyer ask a bunch of doofuses off the street what they think? I mean, maybe you think that's the general public and if I can persuade them, but the stakes are different. It's even like another analogy that people probably know is these so-called trolley car problems, right? You're walking the track, you see these workmen, there's a trolley car, and do you divert it? Who's ever been in that situation? First of all, use your freaking voice and yell. Get off the track, right? I mean, it's such an artificial statement. Or you're a French farmhand, and in World War II, and you have hiding Jews in the basement, and the Nazis come in. What do you do? I mean, no one's been in that situation, right? So I actually have saved, I think, 3 or 4 people's lives just from being around places. And it's not a thought process like, oh, this person is drowning, I'm going to jump in and pull them out, right? So it's like, I'm a good swimmer. I'm assessing the situation. If it's a raging water, no, I'm not going to jump in. I'm going to get killed. But, kid in the bottom of a pool, yeah, I've jumped in a couple of times and pulled kids out. Not much risk to me, but not really much of a thought process. So I think we over intellectualize a lot of this feedback they would get from individuals, right? So if you're on a real jury, the stakes are totally different than if you're just some folks off the street. So again, I think you need to, what's new now is you can measure these emotional responses with technology, not just my technology. There's lots of kinds of technology that, it is not that hard to use, that you can actually get objective and second by second data, not just like, I like it.
Yeah.
Plus, we tend to be pleasers, right? I don't want to be like some practiced, well-educated lawyer. Like, that sucked.
Yeah.
People might do that who have, oppositional personalities, but generally, like, hey, that was pretty good, dude. Yeah, I guess it's all right. But have you ever gotten any real feedback, Doug, that's useful?
Well, that is the great challenge with sentencing videos, because you get, usually the result is as much of the feedback as I can muster, which is to say, if I get an extraordinary sentencing result, then I hopefully can attribute that to the storytelling or the video, but that's guesswork. And we have tried, so one of my colleagues, Alan Ellis, does these articles of You from the Bench, where he goes around and interviews judges. So it's essentially a focus group, right? Just talking about what moves them at sentencing, what doesn't move them at sentencing. And then he'll ask, what do you think about sentencing videos? And most judges will say, yeah, I think I like those, or they could be effective, or, and some will say, I don't want those. Very few, but they will. And that doesn't tell us that much either, because I don't know exactly if they know what they like about them, or if they know what they dislike about them. Maybe this is back to the wall and the clock on the wall, that this forces them to really focus in on the human truth behind this story, and it's hard. That's emotionally draining, right?
It is, but there are ways to. And we're talking about influence here, right? So again, that judge, that jury, they're going to do what they're going to do, but we want to present the information as effectively as possible to support the client. Using people's names, repetition, slowing down, changing vocal tone, changing the volume. I mean, all that are little cues that your brain goes, oh, something's happening here, right?
Mm-hmm.
I shouldn't return to baseline, right? So.
Well, and you said in the book, I saw something about close-ups and the effect that so when I make a sentencing video, I get in real close to the face. But what's the science? What's the science behind that, and why getting close up to the face is effective?
Right. So if I'm back here, right, so it's much harder to read kind of my emotional state, even if my volume is the same, than if I'm here, right? You can see me, like, I'm smiling, I'm excited about this, right? So again, we are sharing emotions in our faces. Again, they're complicated, but I want to be able to see that genuineness. So I think the other thing that we've left out, which is important, is that as social creatures, we're constantly trying to influence each other. But we're also acutely aware when people are not being honest with us. So we've published research showing that on self-report, people can not identify who's being dishonest, but their brains, there's an unconscious part of your brain, knows right away. So again, I may be able to fool you in the short term, but if that person has a chance to reflect, and you have this sort of feeling, we all have this, right? You meet someone new at a party or something, or like, something sketchy about this guy, right? You can't put your finger on it, but you have this feeling. So again, I'll tell you about one of these experiments very briefly. We had people watch CEO apology videos. So this is when something goes wrong with a company. No matter how much of a capitalist you are, we all get a small thrill when we see that perp walk by the CEO. This is like the BP oil spill guy, and the United Airlines had one, and anyway. So we know the outcome. So, a day or two after this crisis, the CEO gets on TV and says, oh, very sorry, we're going to fix this thing. And half those they were fixed and half they weren't. And people could not tell. We paid them, and we let them, like, if we're going to pay you to watch each video, and you can double your money if you bet on whether this was, no, they can't, on betting, they can't tell who fixed it, who didn't. But this immersion response in the brain very clearly and accurately identified which CEOs were lying and which had fixed the problem. So our brain knows.
Interesting. All right, I want to go back to immersion, and we talked about linking the call to action to peak immersion points. But what we didn't talk about is this kind of idea of sustained immersion and why that's not necessarily a good thing. So can you tell me kind of about the peaks and the valleys that we want to shoot for when it comes to immersion?
Also, good question. So again, if I'm doing very short-term stories, we talked about 3 or 4 minutes, then the brain can easily sustain immersion for that period of time. So again, classic story structure, want to build emotion, lead to a peak. Again, I may not want to resolve that story. And so I can do that in 3 minutes really effectively. If it's going to run for 15 minutes or 20 minutes, you generally want to modulate the amount of energy that you're asking the brain to expend on processing this information. So immersion data is almost always a sine wave. When I have a peak immersion moment, then the brain needs a little refractory period to recover. So just like muscles fatigue when you work out, neurons also fatigue, it turns out. And so there's this kind of wave pattern. Now, if that wave pattern is driving to a peak, that's great. Or if it's really long form storytelling, which I would think of as maybe 30 minutes, 20, 30 minutes or longer to kind of movie length, 2-3 hours, then you have multiple storylines. So that's another way to sustain immersion, which is have a storyline, have a kind of an immersion peak, and then have another storyline with lower immersion, get the person a chance, or those neurons a chance to recover a little bit, build that up. So it depends on the kind of richness of your story. But I think the classic, narrative arc, you can do in 3 to 5 minutes and still have some. You're still going to have some variation. It's not straight up. Remember the Freytag triangle, like straight up, straight down. No, brain never does that. But you can trend it up. But again, really think about. I think the key here is that if I'm going to put an immersion peak in there, that's when I really want that call to action, if possible. So there is something called the peak end rule. So we tend to remember and be influenced more when there's an immersion peak at the end of a story. So again, that's counter to the classic storytelling structure, which is I want to resolve the story. So I want to tell the story, have the peak, and maybe hold it at the top, and then just have lots of tension, and then the judge is going to have to fill in where that story goes. That could be a very effective structure. Maybe you do that already, Doug. Maybe I'm just talking out of turn.
I'm trying to think about whether I do that. I'm not sure that I do. I certainly will now, though. But this is good to kind of go back and think about which movies really, really hit home runs, and then look at those, maybe measure those, and see why. But even it may just be, well, from a filmmaker's perspective, it makes me think of what I was really not good at the beginning of this journey that I was on, which is just the onslaught of information. It's a lot of information coming at you with really very little downtime. So it's like rapid fire. And what I started to figure out is that people just need a break. And whether it's just that's why you see in these documentaries, these like little panoramic shots of a landscape, or the nice drone footage going overhead in the neighborhood, or just things that you're just immersed, but you're not receiving information. You're not working very hard during that period of time. So that's exactly what we're going for. And in verbal communication, is it just as simple as taking a nice long pause every now and again?
Pause is the speaker's superpower.
Yeah.
Right. If you can get on stage and hold a pause for 3 to 5 seconds, which is really hard, you build that anticipation. So again, think from a brain perspective, which is where I come from. Talking. Something changed. Now my brain, also I get that dopamine kick in, like, oh, something's going on here. So particularly if I kind of create a pregnant pause, right? So I'm leading up to something and I just hold back. It's really powerful. So in the book, I talked about, great movie makers like Martin Scorsese. Scorsese uses a ton of quiet. Certainly, in Spielberg, if you look at these great movies, there are periods of just nothing. I mean, there may be a little bit of dialogue, or there may be, maybe a little bit of background music while there's no dialogue. Or think of the scene in Godfather 1 when Michael Corleone is going to kill the corrupt policeman, right? You hear the train getting louder, right? He gets the gun out of the bathroom. There's nothing happening. In fact, you see the mouths moving, but no, the train's taking all that. It's just crazy, right? It's getting louder and louder, and it builds that emotional things. So think about that from a storytelling perspective, either live or recorded, that you can have breaks in there. You can have, you can linger on the face, you can linger on the idea and kind of let that percolate a little bit, and then bring them back. So I think you're exactly right, Doug. I think having those breaks allows people the kind of bandwidth to then come back and then be more immersed in the next section that you're talking about.
Okay, dear listeners, we're going to stop right here and we're going to come back next week. So I'm going to allow you a little break to get your bandwidth back and come back for the rest of our discussion with Dr. Paul Zak about immersion. And don't forget, stay till the end of the episode because we're going to run a few minutes of one of my sensing videos through Dr. Zak's immersion platform and see how that goes. You're not going to want to miss it. Thanks for being here. See you next week. That's it for today, but before we go, I just wanted to take a moment and say thank you to you, the listener, for spending time with us today getting set for sentencing. Whether you're a lawyer, someone who could use the help, or maybe you're just a true crime buff who loves the inside scoop on how this whole thing works, I am so glad you're here, and I hope you keep listening. If you're interested in knowing more about what I do, mitigation videos, case consults, live teaching, on-demand educational content, books, articles, all of it, please visit www.dougpassanlaw.com. I'm Doug Passan. Until next time, hang in there. Wait a minute, that's a stupid way to sign off on a podcast about sentencing. Hang in there. What's the matter with you, man? I guess they call that gallows humor. Sorry. All right. Well, I will see you next time on Set for Sentencing. Bye-bye.